So it's part 3 of lesson 11. And what we are going to need to do is work with our in-memory database so we can actually now test the CRUD operations in our controller. So one thing I'm going to do first, we're going to write a whole bunch of unit tests. Every one of them, we're going to create an instance of our controller and pass the database context. So I'm actually going to move this up into test initialize. So we will create controller object and pass the DB. So that way we don't need to do it. Whoops. And we'll also declare it. That causes an error here. So I'm actually going to declare it up here. I'll declare it as a products controller. Whoops, sorry. Hope if I had the right name, it's the pets controller. So then I can take out the var down here. So we're going to declare it up here, but we're not going to create it until after we've set up the database. We have to set up the database first because our controller requires a database. Okay, so we'll declare it at the class level. And then once we're done creating and populating our database, so we don't actually even need any arrange here. There's nothing else we have to do. The arrange now just happens inside of test initialize. Some of the other methods will still have an arrange, but not index because there's no setup. The only thing we need is our controller. So now we also need to create a bit of data and put it in the database. So I'm going to create a list of type pet called pets. We'll initialize a new list of pets. Our unit testing project has no idea what a pet is, so we'll just have to reference the models of our web project. So once we add a reference, so again, we're doing this at the controller level. We only need to declare our pet list once, and then it will be available in all of our methods. Now we want to populate our in-memory DB with 1 category and 3 pets. Actually, sorry, we can just do it this way. You can say, yeah, context. Sorry, I'm going to create a category first. Our category equals new category. So our ID is, I don't know, 1,000. And the name will be mock category. We'll then save that category to our database. Context.categories.add. So that's going to populate a category into our in-memory database once we call save changes. We can now create a few pets. Pets.add a new pet. So every pet needs an ID. Needs a name. needs a category ID, which will be 1,000, and also needs a category object. Now we need to check our pet model just to see if there are any other required fields. We don't necessarily have to populate all the fields of each pet, like the image is optional, but I want to check and make sure. We may also need a price. So I'm just going to go and look at my pet model. So I can open it up, and the shortcut is I can just right click the word pet and say go to definition. That actually opens the model. Okay, so we've got an ID, we've got a name, age and price are both required, so we better assign age and price properties as well. So there's our first pet. I then want to create 2 more pets. And I should ensure that the pet ID and names are different for each of them. So I can make up the ID numbers. Okay, so they're all going to be in the same category. So they all get the same category ID and category parent. So you can fill in any values you like for the IDs, the names, the ages, and the prices. Okay, and you'll do this in your assignment. You're going to mock a few objects. So Colton, you'll mock up 3 player objects, for example. Chris, you might mock up 3 species. And then we want to put these records so then I'm going to add all of them to our database context. Context.pets.add. Going to add each pet. So now I've got 1 category in my category DB set. I've got 3 pets in the pets DB set. And now I want to commit those changes to the database. I'll call context.save changes. So this will actually insert those 4 records into the in-memory database. So we'll now have a database in memory with 1 category and 3 pets. We can then work with this mock data in our unit tests. I'll actually upload this code to GitHub right now in case you missed something or you're behind. 3 mock DB populated. Okay, so I've uploaded. So I want to write one more unit test now, where we're again testing the index method, but instead of checking the view name, we want to check the data model that comes out. And if I go and look at my views, pets, right, what we want to inspect is basically the data model. That when we call index, we should be fetching back a list of pets. So let's go and write this test. So index returns pets. We don't need any arrange because the arrange is automatically done for us in test initialize. Right? Our controller is created. We don't have to supply any values or parameters. So we can just act and then assert. So in this case, again, we're going to call our controller.index.result. But the result, this just gives us a view, which is okay. So we want to assert.our equal our pets list. That's what we are expecting. And we're comparing it to our result.model. As the data gets returned, same as our list of pets in the in-memory DB. So we're expecting they should be the same. If we have 3 pets in our database, when we call index and check the data, the model, it should be giving us the same list back. Now, right now, it fails. Let's look at why. I'm going to run it. So it's saying, okay, I did one thing wrong. First of all, if we are checking lists, we don't actually use assert. Assert is for checking 2 single things. Number 1 is our assert, we should be using collection assert, because we're checking 2 different lists. So this is number 1. And number 2, yeah, we've got to convert this. This is just a generic object. So we're going to cast this as a list of type pet. Okay, so this makes our error go away. We're checking, is this list of type pets equal to this result if we also convert it or cast it as a list of pets? So this fixes 2 of the errors. I'm going to run the test again. And we run it, and our test magically fails. Does collection assert failed? Element at index 0 do not match. Any suggestions as to why? Why might this be failing? So it is now saying we have 2 lists of pets, but it's actually this result saying they're not equal. The first element is not the same in each list. I can use the debugger here where we can actually compare the lists in real time. So I'll put in a breakpoint, I'll debug my test. And now if I put my mouse over, so here's my pets variable. Here's our database. It says we've got 3 items in the list. And it says my first pet is Lassie. And when I compare it to the model here, it also says I got 3 pets. But in this case, my first pet instead, the name is Albert. So where is Lassie is actually my second pet in my data model. In our database list here, Lassie's first. And then Albert, and then Sophie. So I have 2 lists. I've got the same 3 pets in there, but it's saying the lists aren't the same. Why would the lists not be the same? Thank you, Jordan. Exactly. If we go and look at our index method, we have an order by clause here. We are first ordering by the category name, and then we're ordering by the pet name. So we're going to need to, in order to check this, right, in order to properly check the data, not only should we be checking that we got the pet data, but it should be in the right order. Because on this page, we want them displayed first by category and then by pet name. So our unit test needs to reflect that sorting as well. So to fix this, we're going to say dot order by first our category dot name and then by our pet name. And then I have to convert this to a list. And now my live unit testing says, okay, now that you've sorted the database in the same order that the method is sorting it, your test should pass. We could also break this up into multiple lines. If it's getting a little messy, we could do the sorting first. We don't have to do it all in one line. I'll run the test again now and it should pass. So now I run it and now our test is passing. So this is the result we want. We want the data, but we want it in a specific order. So our unit test is forcing us to think really carefully about exactly what should happen in this method. It's not enough to just dump the pets in random order. They need to be alphabetized first by category and then by pet name. So now we should be able to go and write our details tests. So we're going to test, I think we need 4 tests here. We're going to test the unit test, the 3 scenarios we outlined: no ID, invalid ID, and then valid ID. We want to make sure we get the right pet, and we also want to make sure we get the right view. So we'll need 4 tests. Now, we also said we wanted to fix this problem, this not found, where we call pet details without an ID. It just gives us a blank screen, which is lousy. So let's complete this. Let's make a 404 page quickly. Or you know what, just to keep it simple, as David mentioned, we could have an error page. We've already got a shared error page. Let's just load that view instead. We won't worry about a 404 page for now. So on line 38, where our ID is null in pet details, instead of returning not found, let's return the view called error. So if there's no ID, no, that's odd. I didn't expect that. Let me just build. I had to compile my code. Oh, this isn't great. Okay, we don't want to use that page because it's got a bunch of code on that page that's also crashing. Sorry, we will build a 404 page. So I'm going to right click my shared folder. We'll just add an empty view called 404. Sorry, but we can't find the resource you requested. So if there's no ID, we want to return the 404 view. So in our pets controller, we'll change this to say return 404. So now I get this page if there's no ID. We're going to do the same thing on line 46. If they give us an ID, but that ID doesn't exist in the database, again, the user is going to get our 404 page. So I go to details, put in a number that I know doesn't exist in the database, we get 404. While we're changing these return view statements, we should also change this one here. When we have a valid ID, yes, we're going to pass back a pet model, but we're also going to be explicit that we are loading the details view, not the edit view, not create, not index, not delete, but we want to make sure the correct page gets loaded. So now we can do 4 tests. They're all going to be quite similar. We're going to test calling details without an ID and ensure we get 404. We're going to test calling details with an ID that doesn't exist. Again, we're going to make sure we get 404. We'll then write 2 tests with a valid ID. One test is going to make sure that the details view loads, and the last test will make sure that the pet data we see matches the ID we provided. Okay, so 4 tests, but it will be a fair bit of copy and paste and just make small adjustments in each test. So we've got string parameters now as part of all 3 of our return view statements. We're very intentional about exactly which view loads under which scenario. So now we can go write our tests. So put a comment maybe above this section. Details, null, ID, loads, 404. So our result equals, again, we're checking for a view result. We want to know what page gets loaded. Controller.details. We're just going to pass in a null. Whoops. Result. So call details, but don't give it any ID. In this case, we are expecting 404, and we're going to compare it to the name of the view. So when I save it, my live unit testing will kind of run that logic in the background. I missed something here. Notice it doesn't run. I missed this test method. Without it, your unit test isn't going to run. So every unit test needs that test method heading. So now I can run. And my test passes, yep. If you call details and pass in no ID, you get 404. Chris, under views and shared. That way it can be called from any controller.
Okay, thank you.
Our next test is pretty much a copy and paste, and we'll just make 2 very minor changes. So copy that. I'm going to change the name this time. It's an invalid ID. So I can pass in any ID number that doesn't exist in the database. Right, what IDs did I use? I've got 28, 16, and 49. So any one of those, any other number will be fine. You know, if I put in ID 7, if I run my tests, it should pass because this is not a valid ID. So I should get my 404 page. This test passes as well. So I don't need that comment. So we just need 2 more tests. This time though, we need to pass in a valid ID. We're gonna have 1 test to check the data and 1 test to check the view. Copy. I'll change my test name to details valid ID loads details view. So I have to use one of the valid ID numbers. I think I've put in 16, 28, 16, and 49. So any one of those. And if I have a valid ID, I expect to see the details view. Okay, so we're testing those 3, we're simulating those 3 scenarios we talked about earlier in the class. We don't have an ID, we have an ID, but we don't have a match. And then we have an ID that does actually exist. Okay, so all my tests are passing right now. In Test Explorer, I should see that 7 tests. All are passing. And I'm going to copy this one. And we also want to check, so we'll say details valid ID loads pet or returns pet. So when I put in a valid ID, I should get back the matching pet object. So we can check it this way. In this case, I could even say, I guess I can't do it that way. That's all right. So we're going to assert art equal. So 16 is my second pet. Right? If I pass in that ID, I should get, I'm expecting to get pets 1. So at index, and I'm going to compare that to my result dot model. Is the pet object I get back the same as the second pet in the database? So the ID number has to match the right position. So if I pass in ID, yeah, it's the same as pet 1. If I put in pet 0, my test will fail. Because ID 16, that's not the first pet in the list, it's the second pet in the list. Right, so if I run this now, it will die and say, okay, you have 2 pets, but they're not the same. Because pet 0 is my ID 28. Okay, so to get it to pass, I need to make sure the ID matches the actual record in our mock database. So the great thing about our tests is if we make a lot more changes to the controller, or maybe we have to update the controller years from now when our application's running, we keep the unit tests so we can rerun them anytime we make changes. And the unit tests are going to catch any errors that we create when we change our code. And if I go and look at my code coverage now, we can see, okay, we're up to almost 7% of the whole project. And in my pets controller, now our details method is 100% covered. If we go and look in details, all that code is now blue. So index is blue and details also blue. We haven't tested the other methods. So we've made progress, right? Our controller is at least up to, as a whole, our pets controller, well, it's 5% covered. So what we'll do next week is we'll sort of divide up the other methods in here, and as an in-class lab, and it will be marked, you're going to write the tests needed for each method. Each group will be assigned 1 or 2 methods to write the tests for. And then if we compile them all together, we should be able to unit test close to 100% of this one controller. Okay. I'm going to push up to get